Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving straight into the fascinating science and the regulatory reality behind one of the most talked about food additives on the planet, aspartame. Whether you know it as NutraSweet, Canderel, or E951, it is literally everywhere. But naturally, with that kind of widespread use comes a ton of questions. So we're going to unpack exactly what the science says, using the source data to guide us every single step of the way. Let's get into it.
Right off the bat, we need to address the elephant in the room, don't we? If you spend even 5 minutes searching the internet, you'll find a tremendous amount of public anxiety and anecdotal claims about artificial sweeteners. People are constantly asking, is this safe to put in my morning coffee? Is it safe for my kids? Well, our goal today isn't to get bogged down in rumors. Instead, we're setting a totally neutral, investigative tone and looking strictly at the cold, hard facts, the chemistry, and the rigorous evaluations done by major global health organizations.
So here is our game plan. We'll quickly cover its discovery and everyday uses, then dive into the chemistry and metabolic breakdown, understand daily dietary exposure, look closely at health effects and PKU, and finally, wrap up with global safety and regulation.
Section 1. Discovery and everyday uses. From the lab to the grocery store.
Aspartame wasn't the result of some multi-million-dollar quest to find the ultimate sugar replacement. It was actually discovered entirely by accident. Back in 1965, in a lab at the GD Cereal Company, a researcher just kind of stumbled upon it. And since that accidental discovery, it has become one of the most highly scrutinized compounds in our entire food supply. By 1980, the joint FAO/WHO Expert Committee on Food Additives, which is a mouthful so we just call them JEFTA, allocated an acceptable daily intake. A few years later, in 1984, the US FDA established its own daily intake limits. So it went from a total lab accident to a globally evaluated sweetener in just a couple of decades.
Now, what's really wild here is how the concentration levels vary so drastically across the everyday stuff we buy. You'd probably guess that diet beverages would be the heaviest hitters, right? But they actually sit at around 500 milligrams per kilogram. Gelatin desserts bump that up just a bit to 800, but look at chewing gum and breath mints. They pack a massive density of aspartame per kilogram. We're talking up to 6,000 milligrams for breath mints. It's just a fascinating look at how manufacturers have to tweak their use of the sweetener for totally different product types.
Section 2. Chemistry and metabolic breakdown. What happens inside the body?
Okay, so what actually is aspartame on a chemical level? It's a dipeptide ester. Essentially, that's just a simple combination of two amino acids with the formula C14H18N2O5. But the absolute game changer here is its sheer potency. It is 180 to 200 times sweeter than regular sugar. No joke. Because of this incredible sweetness, food manufacturers only have to use a microscopic amount to get the taste right. You aren't consuming huge spoonfuls of this stuff, you're consuming tiny fractions of a milligram in most individual servings.
But it does have some pretty specific physical limitations. Its stability depends heavily on temperature and pH. If it gets too hot, it degrades and breaks down, entirely losing its sweetness. That's exactly why it is totally unsuitable for heat-treated baked goods. You won't find it in your oven-baked cookies. Also, if the pH drops too much in liquids, poof, the sweetness is gone. However, it holds up beautifully in deep frozen products, so its actual chemistry dictates exactly where you will and definitely won't find it hiding in the grocery aisles.
So, what goes down when you actually consume it? The second aspartame hits your gastrointestinal tract, your digestive enzymes go right to work. They immediately break the sweetener down into 3 naturally occurring dietary components: aspartic acid, phenylalanine, and methanol. I want to stress this. These aren't bizarre synthetic chemicals lingering in your stomach. These are totally normal components your body naturally processes all the time from a wide variety of everyday foods.
And here is the absolutely crucial takeaway. The resulting blood levels of that aspartic acid and phenylalanine, they do not exceed your normal everyday after-meal levels. Furthermore, the amount of methanol formed is so minuscule that it's essentially non-detectable after you consume it. The source data is explicitly clear on this. The formation of methanol from aspartame is nowhere near sufficient to induce methanol toxicity. Your body handles it just like any other regular meal.
Section 3. Understanding daily dietary exposure. The math of safety.
To really wrap our heads around food additive safety, we have to talk about the Acceptable Daily Intake, or ADI. This is the health-based guidance value that establishes a strict, safe daily consumption limit. And health organizations calculate this with a massive built-in safety buffer. JECFA has set this limit at 40 milligrams per kilogram of body weight per day, while the US FDA gives it a slightly higher ceiling at 50 milligrams per kilogram.
I really want to anchor on this specific number right here, 40. 40 milligrams per kilogram of body weight every single day. That is the global baseline ADI established by major expert panels as being completely safe for human consumption. Keep that number in your back pocket as we look at how much people actually consume in the real world.
This data brilliantly illustrates the reality of our dietary exposure. When researchers went out and looked at actual dietary intake across different countries, and yes, this includes children and diabetics who naturally might consume a lot more intense sweeteners, they found that the average consumer only takes in between 0.1 and 10% of that maximum limit. Even when they specifically looked at high consumers, like people who drink diet beverages heavily, they still only hit up to 20% of the ADI. So the buffer zone between what people actually drink and eat and what is deemed the maximum safe limit is massive.
Section 4. Health Effects and PKU. Why warning labels matter.
Okay, so for the vast majority of people, the general population, there is absolutely zero health risk at exposures up to that ADI limit we just broke down. However, and this is a massive however, we must clearly contrast that with individuals who have a condition called PKU. For these folks, consuming aspartame poses a severe, very real health risk. Why? Because of their body's inability to process one specific breakdown component, phenylalanine.
Let's break down the actual mechanics of this. PKU, which stands for phenylketonuria, is a genetic metabolic disorder. Because individuals with PKU simply cannot metabolize phenylalanine, it starts to accumulate at dangerously high levels in their blood and their brain. If that's left unmanaged, those high concentrations in the brain can result in severe mental impairment. And because, as we saw earlier, aspartame breaks down into phenylalanine, it becomes highly toxic for this specific subgroup.
This very specific metabolic reality is exactly why you see those bold warning labels on products in the grocery store. Strict global regulations mandate that any food containing aspartame must carry a warning. In the EU, it clearly states contains a source of phenylalanine, and in the US, it reads phenylketonurics contains phenylalanine. These labels aren't slapped on there because the additive is dangerous to the general public. Rather, they serve as an absolutely vital safety mechanism to protect individuals living with PKU.
Section 5. Global Safety and Regulation, Expert Consensus versus Public Concern.
Now, over the years, there have been a lot of anecdotal reports linking aspartame consumption to things like headaches, nausea, seizures, and even brain tumors. It is really important that we acknowledge these concerns, but it is equally important to look at what the actual data says. Extensive post-marketing surveillance and highly comprehensive laboratory animal studies have been conducted for decades, and the expert groups reviewing these massive datasets consistently confirm that aspartame has low oral toxicity and demonstrates zero mutagenic or carcinogenic properties.
To really understand how these safety panels operate, let's look at a very specific event from 2006. A study, often called the Belpaghi study, made headlines by reporting that aspartame caused tumors in rats. Immediately, both the European Food Safety Authority and the US FDA stepped in to review the findings. And both of these expert panels independently concluded that there was no valid evidence of a carcinogenic effect. They rejected the findings completely. Why? Well, due to significant flaws in the study's design and, actually, major problems with how the data was interpreted overall.
Because it has survived this absolute gauntlet of scientific scrutiny, aspartame remains legally approved as a sweetening agent by the US FDA, the European Union, and in Japan. But remember, these aren't just a free pass. These approvals come with strictly defined maximum limits for different foods, and of course the mandatory PKU labeling requirements we just went over.
To really sum up the scientific perspective here, I want to read this definitive quote straight from the Food Safety Brief. Listen to this. Periodic expert group assessments of the scientific literature have consistently concluded that the data do not support these concerns. The overwhelming scientific consensus holds firm. For the general population, aspartame is safe when consumed within the established limits.
Well, we've covered the accidental lab discovery, the insane chemistry of its sweetness, the biological breakdown into normal everyday amino acids, the rigorous math behind the acceptable daily intake, and the absolutely crucial protections for those with PKU. So, I leave you with this final thought. Knowing the structured science behind how our bodies naturally process this sweetener and understanding the extensive regulatory frameworks ensuring its safety, how will you approach the label on your next diet beverage? Keep questioning, keep learning, and thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. See you next time.